organised by James Watt, Matthew Hinchcliffe, and Chang Lee, who are in that order on my screen, on behalf of the Grantham Centre. This is a discussion event around fast fashion. My name's Tony Ryan. I'm the director of the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures. In the past, I have been a visiting professor at the University of the Arts London, in London, College of Fashion, and it's a delight to introduce Sandy Buck, who's from the Centre of Sustainable Fashion at the University of the Arts London, and Dr. Mark Sumner from the University of Leeds School of Design, who's a lecturer in sustainability in the textiles industry. And they're first going to tell us their definition of fast fashion, and then in order, Sandy and then Mark will take 5 minutes to introduce themselves, their background, and their interests before we get into the moderated discussion. So if Mark goes first with his definition of fast fashion, and then Sandy can give her definition of fast fashion, and then she can start to tell us about her. Okay, Mark, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. A real hot topic, isn't it, about the fashion industry and the impacts. And always, fast fashion seems to be the criminal in the dock in terms of some of these big issues. I'm going to start with a little bit of background, just very quickly, just so you understand why my definition is the definition. I worked in the retail industry for many, many years, and I ended up leaving the retail industry because I just didn't understand consumers. I just found them to be completely irrational. Having left the retail industry and working at the university now, I've done quite a lot of reading and research around consumer behaviour and understanding how consumers engage with fashion. So my definition of fast fashion is not about the brand, it's not about it's not about the product, it's actually based on the individual. How we define whether something is going to be fast fashion is a very personal, a very individual perspective. And I'm sure we can all look at our wardrobes and say, there's a garment in that wardrobe that I bought last week. I'm not going to wear it again. I don't like it. I've decided that's enough. That is very clearly fast fashion. And I'm sure everyone will be able to look at their wardrobes and go, there's a garment that I've been wearing for the past 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And that is somewhat independent of where the products come from or which brand. It's about our emotional connection to that product. So that's sort of my starter for 10 in terms of definition of fast fashion.
Okay. And over to you, Sandy.
Hi, yes, thanks. I don't know about whether it's a definition, it's just really a comment, really, because I just think at its best, fast fashion has democratized fashion. If we think about the mass-produced, easily available at every high street, but at its worst, it's stimulated rampant consumerism and a race to the bottom in terms of the production mechanisms, and the concern for the people who've possibly been making it in many cases, not all cases, and it's also proved to be for those businesses proved to be very successful business models. So it's very contradictory, but I mean, really, what has happened is it's stimulated this overproduction and overconsumption, which it's not so much to do with the product itself, because we can all enjoy some of the products, but it's to do with the totality and the volume, and the churn and the throughput that is really the issue with fast fashion.
Right. So just before we get into the discussion, Sandy, do you want to tell us a bit about your background, your core interests, your research?
Okay, yes, thanks. And I'm really pleased for inviting me to this event, as James and colleagues have done. So yes, I'm Professor of Fashion and Textile Design and Technology. It's a bit of a mouthful, but all of those things come together for me. in terms of the work that I do at the Centre for Sustainable Fashion. And we work collectively on different projects, research, knowledge exchange, and education projects. So we work with industry, we research the industry, and we work with the industry as well. And the centre was established back in 2008, and that was quite a significant year, as it happened, for sustainable fashion awareness raising. Some of the first books on the subject were published that year, including my colleague Kate Fletcher's Sustainable Fashion and Textiles, my own book, Eco Chic, The Fashion Paradox, which aimed to inform readers about the entire fibre to fashion to retail to waste cycles and profile some of the pioneers of sustainable fashion. And the paradox I talk about is about the fact, you know, we just talked about fast fashion, that the implicit waste and throughput is what actually sustains lots and lots of livelihoods, as we know. So there's huge numbers of paradoxes within the fashion system. A few years later, I published another book, The Sustainable Fashion Handbook, which brought together many different perspectives and voices and debates about fashion, and included some large businesses, profiles. There's over 100 articles, and especially the designer fashion sector, which wasn't saying as much at that point, and including luxury fashion companies and micro fashion businesses. But before I became a lecturer, I had my own fashion knitwear label for many years, and I was selling internationally, so I was a fashion business. And I noticed since then, obviously, there's still the issues that we all faced in trying to set up and maintain a business that's making something creative are still very much the same. Lots has changed, such as communication technologies and so on, but so much hasn't. And so I've been, in my research, I've been interested to highlight the role of design practice in fashion research. And also fashion research was a fairly unknown thing, apart from sort of historical and cultural studies of fashion. So I also set up some research projects. In 2005, I ran an agenda setting project called Interrogating Fashion as part of an initiative called Designing for the 21st Century. And then out of this, one of the things that came out, I founded an academic journal called Fashion Practice, Design, Creative Process and the Fashion Industry. And that's now in its 13th year. And that was, again, trying to bring forward the voice of practitioners and people who were inside the industry rather than people outside looking in. And since then, I've developed a number of research projects that are design-led and often work with micro and small fashion businesses. And one of those was Considerate Design for Personalised Fashion, where I was looking particularly at the role, different ways, different technologies to help customise and personalise fashion, so that we could people could engage with it in a deeper way and for longer. So I'm very much interested in the role of design-led small businesses in helping to transform the fashion industry. And the current project that we're working on, which is coming to an end right now, Fostering Sustainable Practices, it's worked with 50 businesses, fashion businesses and fashion service businesses as well, to identify new and more holistic ways of working, aiming to create a new form of sustainable prosperity that's they're all embracing, not just looking at economic considerations only, looking at cultural, environmental, social aspects as well. And we've developed a number of different outputs, both academic and industry facing, and to inform policy, and including a guidebook for support organisations to mentor sustainable businesses. And these will be available on a hub, Fostering Sustainable Practices hub on our website, Centre for Sustainable Fashion. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. That's a great summing up of a very productive career, moving from the industry to academy. And again, for those of you who weren't here for the beginning of the chat, Sandy and I have known each other for quite some time, since about 2008, actually, when you were starting that work. So it's great to see you again here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Over to you for your your research journey that brings you to being on Blackboard Collaborate talking about fast fashion.
Thanks, Tony. So I started off doing a PhD in textile engineering some years ago, and as a result of that, got this interest in textiles, and then ended up working for a small retailer called Marks and Spencer's. You may have heard of them, maybe, and cut my teeth really for the first 10 years of my career there in terms of understanding the textile industry as a part of the buying team. I was involved in sourcing, I was involved in product development, and then I had 5-6 years of managing the sustainability strategy and policy for the business. And interestingly, it was around the same time that Sandy was talking about that 2007-2008 period, where all of a sudden everyone was not everyone, lots of people were getting interested in fashion and clothing and trying to understand some of the challenges that lay ahead. And back then there was very little in terms of roadmap on how you do these things. So we were doing all sorts of interesting projects around animal welfare, around cotton production, sustainable design. And lots of that stuff is carried on through in terms of my academic career. So having left the retail industry, have been at the University of Leeds for the past 8 or 9 years, and have engaged in projects looking at diverse projects, looking at things like modern slavery and the impact that COVID has had on modern slavery within the garment supply chain. And that's very much focusing on not just garment making factories, but the full supply chain all the way down to cotton production. Got a couple of projects running at the moment on microplastics and exploring the link between textiles, domestic laundry, and ocean pollution. Already mentioned consumer behaviour is a hobby horse of mine to try and understand why we're all so crazy when it comes to buying things. So did quite a lot of work around that. All the way through my career, there's been a very strong focus on materials and understanding the material impacts of products and processes that are used within the textile clothing production supply chain. And more recently been involved in quite a lot of work looking at circularity and also looking at garment durability. And we're just in the process of writing a paper at the moment where looking at garment durability, we found an inverse relationship between the retail price of a garment and its durability. Essentially what we found was garments that are more expensive are going to be less durable than garments that are cheaper, which really flies in the face of your view of the general view of fast fashion. So we've got some interesting work that's going on there. And I think that last project in particular, it sort of encapsulates what we are trying to do within our work here at Leeds. And that's to take a systemic view of the industry. And as we're doing that, what we're trying to do is to bust some of those myths that exist about textiles and fashion. There's a lot of myths out there, a lot of stuff that appears to be made up because there's no hard evidence. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to challenge the current mindset around some of the issues that the industry is facing.
Thank you both very much. So that was to set the scene for what comes next. And we're going to discuss first consumerism and rate of consumption. So the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures has two overarching goals. One is enough for everyone. So it encapsulates our view that the Earth's meagre resources should be shared out equitably amongst all the people who live on the Earth, and increasingly taking care of all the other organisms that we coexist with. And the other is reducing global consumption. So we recognise that resource consumption is driving climate change through a whole variety of mechanisms. And often we see the fashion industry as as the apotheosis of consumerism. It's the first industry that basically designs obsolescence in the whole spring, summer, autumn, winter collections, year on year, and it's designed obsolescence and consumption in microcosm. So please, your views on fast fashion as the pinnacle of consumerism.
I think I said something.
Go on, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just referring, saying as I was saying before about this stimulating rampant consumerism, because it has, the benefits that it's perhaps started off with, of making things accessible. I mean, I think clothing is one of the few things that in the last 15, 20 years has consistently gone down in price compared with and up in volume compared obviously with most other things, such as housing and transport and energy and so on. And so it obviously, it absolutely can't continue. And obviously some of the bigger industry sort of collaborative organizations like Global Fashion Agenda and Sustainable Apparel Coalition have been formed in a sort of pre-competitive way to try to talk the talk about what can be done. But I think we're in the process. There's a lot of target setting at the moment. So I think that there has to be different messages put across. We've got the marketing side of fashion as well as the experiential side of it. And I think that you said what's enough for everyone, and I think encouraging a sort of sufficiency is a totally new pivot that has to happen, and we it's the business model has to change. It has to systemically change, and things have to get more expensive, and we have to buy less. We have to make less stuff.
But you talked about the democratization of fashion and the accessibility of clothing, so that people have more clothes than they ever had before. Having kind of working clothes and Sunday best, and you might have had 2 sets of working clothes. That's changed completely. There aren't many people, certainly in the global north, that don't have far more clothes than they really need.
Absolutely. Yeah, and most of them are not used. We know that they sit in wardrobes and all of that.
It's the access. The material benefit to people of having more clothing. Surely that's that was a good thing brought by fast fashion or fast clothing.
I don't think it's about it's not. It's the quality. It's the experience of being able to enjoy fashion, and the symbolic value of fashion is what gives people pleasure and delight. And I don't think we should end fashion, but I think we have to. It's to do with the volumes. It's to do with the rate of consumption that has really just gone off the radar, and it's fueling that with faster and faster cycles. You talked about autumn, winter, spring, summer. That was the good old days when there were only 2 major seasons. But obviously, in the most recent sort of fashion calendars, that has been ramped up because it's seen that more money by offering more product, new product that's going to not be there in a couple of weeks' time, that people are incentivized to buy and buy immediately. And gone are the days where you would save up for something and then buy it. So it's it's the consumption model. It's not so much the actual experience of fashion itself, I would argue. I think there's something to decouple here.
Mark?
Yeah, well, I think it's not debate. It's not a debate about the scale of the impact the industry has globally. So, according to the Global Fashion Agenda, potentially the fashion industry, clothing, is responsible for about 4% of CO2 emissions. And that sounds like a lot. I mean, it is a lot. But bear in mind that fashion and clothing is one of the few industries that virtually everyone on the planet engages with. So we shouldn't be surprised that this is a very large industry. You know, it's worth, you know, close on $2 trillion worth of trade each year, because virtually everyone engages in fashion. So we've got that as a starting point in terms of where we are with this. But also when we think about our individual impacts as particularly as homeowners. And there was a paper published not so long ago from the University of Leeds by some of my colleagues, and they identified the top 10 aspects of our lives that have the most significant impact on the environment. Clothing did not appear on there at all. As a homeowner, it's about the car that you drive, it's about how many times you get on a plane, it's about the heating, it's about the insulation in your home. So there's all these other things. So as an individual, it's really quite challenging to understand where this fits on the grand scale of all your impacts. But again, it's not to say that the fashion industry doesn't have these impacts. And I think it's important to also recognise that fashion and the speed of which fashion is actually moving along is a cultural phenomena that isn't just about fashion. But I'm not trying to defend the industry, but I'm just trying to put it into context. If we think about how often people change their car, how often people redecorate their homes, how often people will buy new equipment for their kitchen, it's all part of a cultural phenomenon where everything is getting faster. If we take that as a starting point, we can then start to really understand what it is that we can do to try and to rectify or try to resolve the big issues that we're facing. And I think there's a really delicate balance that we have to build here in terms of that democratization that Sandy talked about, and shifting it in the sense to, you know, what we had in the Victorian era. All of those peasants had two outfits, as you say, Tony, one to go to church in and one to go to work in. And so we've got to get that balance right in terms of how we manage those impacts to ensure that what we don't do is end up in a two-tier system. And I think the final thing to say around this is fashion often gets identified as being a really big issue, and that's normally a statement that is made by people who don't understand the value of fashion. And fashion is considered to, you know, by some people to be very facile, to be not an important part of people's lives. If you engage in fashion, you're sometimes, somehow you're not to be taken as seriously as someone that might engage in other things. Fashion is the single most important non-verbal communication device that we have as human beings, and that plays a really important role in everyone's lives. So what we have to be doing in terms of understanding this fast fashion problem is taking into account, all the things I've been talking about, but really importantly, understanding what fashion does for us as individuals, for those people that wear garments, but also making sure that we understand the role that fashion plays in terms of poverty alleviation for cotton farmers in Gujarat in India, garment makers in Bangladesh. It's about taking that systemic view. And it is, as I say, I'm not defending the industry, it is about saying there are some big issues, but we have to make sure that we take a carefully navigated route so we don't have unintended consequences of taking action.
So that connection between the impact in terms of, and I am going to go check up 4% of CO2 emissions. It sounds a little low, but it's kind of the same order of magnitude as Haber-Bosch production of ammonia. 25% of CO2 emissions are in the food system, so it's smaller than the food system. So that plays out right. But given that fashion has this this label of being the poster of consumerism, does fashion have the opportunity to teach that consumerist society a new way forward, whilst recognising the things that Sandy and her colleagues taught me all those years ago, that fashion isn't about the mechanical properties of fibres, it's about self-actualisation. So how can we use the self-actualisation that fashion brings, you know, how you identify yourself and present yourself, with a move away from a consumerist society?
Well, I think, if I could, should I jump in?
Yeah, sorry, Sandy, I was pointing at you, but on my screen.
I don't know. Yeah.
I can't get out of.
Yeah.
Please.
I think, yes, I think it is about appreciate the value of fashion. It does get rolled out as the poster child of the sort of bad, all that's bad. But that's where I talk about the paradox, because that sort of throughput is what maintains livelihoods, and it's very, very important, as Mark's just said, in many areas of producer countries. But it's all about equity. It's all about social justice, ensuring that all of that is happening. But how? I think there is a sort of, I often say, you know, that some people, without thinking, they think things are just born in the shop, you know, or it's just also easily available. But I think if we can get people to appreciate what has got the value, not just of materials, but the value of what has created the products, and they can engage more in perhaps co-creating some element of it, and they can understand the narrative that's behind it, I think that creates a much deeper bond with pieces that people own and they then treasure. I mean, ordering something and having to wait for it, because it's being made specially for you, is a way of really investing in something and that you will value. And I think that, for me, some of those qualities are and the narratives are what are shown by much smaller businesses that could be sort of engaged in a lot more, in order for people to appreciate and keep things. People have to keep things longer. They have to use what they have. They have to keep for longer. And there's also a lot of new things coming up, such as swap. If we want novelty, we can swap something with somebody else, and that will create novelty. There are people developing things which are more experiential, and that things can change, or they can be modular. You know, there's so many ways that we can maintain a sort of very positive engagement with clothes, and it's not just something to be bought, worn once, put on Instagram, and then disposed of. So I think there's opportunities.
Absolutely, I would agree with some of the things that Sandy's talking about there. How do you value a garment when in most cases most people really don't understand where that garment has come from? So, for a typical shirt, for example, I was involved in a project looking at how many people were involved in the manufacturing of a shirt, just a dress, just a normal formal shirt. 28 pairs of hands, just in the garment factory, touched that shirt to make that shirt, to create that shirt for the consumer. And that's just one small part of a supply chain that involves dye houses, spinning mills, fabric mills, involves ginning, and involves cotton farmers around the world. And I find it very frustrating, particularly with government and policymakers, when they have this assumption that the supply chain for a fashion garment is simply a garment making factory. And because people have that view, I think there's a lack of value applied to that garment to understand where it's come from. If you knew how long it took to grow the cotton, if you knew the amount of water that was involved in that production, if you had some understanding of what a farmer's life was like in somewhere like Gujarat in India, or in Pakistan, or in Senegal, I think people would start to value that product better. Now, I think the challenge ultimately the industry has, in particular brands and retailers, and to a certain extent academics like ourselves, is how do we find a way of communicating that to consumers in a way that it doesn't turn out to be a lecture, but it actually is value added to the consumer, so they really understand the value of their products. But ultimately, we can go back thousands of years and know that fashion has always been about newness. It's always been about how you define your status. It's been about how you associate or not associate with different groups and organisations. So we have to bear in mind, and we have to really understand consumer behaviour around this. And you know, it's really difficult to change consumer behaviour. Really difficult. I mean, some of this stuff we're talking about is absolutely hardwired from an evolutionary point of view. You know, we've evolved to have a certain view about how we're viewed by our compatriots. So it's less about changing consumer behaviour, but more about this nudge approach of helping them to understand what's happening, to actually find a better way of delivering what they want from fashion. And it's really interesting what, you know, we see in terms of, let's say, social media. So, you know, social media in many ways has driven this culture of consumerism, and particularly driven this fast fashion approach. But what we are starting to see on social media is people are actually having virtual clothing created for them. And that actually might be a really interesting way that we start to be thinking about how fashion operates. So in many ways, what we're talking about there is you don't have to buy garments anymore. You don't even have to own a physical product. You can actually explore different looks. And when you found the look that works for you, then maybe you press the button to say, I'd like to buy this. So I think there's some really interesting challenges that we need to be thinking about in terms of consumer behaviour, but also some really interesting opportunities that, you know, within fashion and the way that things are changing, that, you know, we may be able to have a bit of a win-win. We give consumers what they want in terms of what fashion does for them, but we do it in a way that's less resource intensive and is more aware and more controlling of wastage at the end of product life as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting you talk about the numbers of pairs of hands in making a shirt. So I grew up in Leeds when Leeds still had a vibrant tailoring industry, and my Aunt Nellie was a pocket hand, and she spent her working life making pockets, and my Auntie Kitty was a presser, and so she pressed the finished garments, and my granddad was a tailor, and his best mate Cyril was a cutter. And if you remember the song, there's a country and western song about a Cadillac, where, you know, someone who worked in the Cadillac factory bought a piece out one at a time. Well, the suit my dad got married in came out of the Burton's factory one piece at a time, because the cutters could always get one more piece out of a suit length than the accountant thought they could. And unfortunately, all of the pieces in my dad's suit were from the same cloth, so he didn't look quite patchwork. So I really do understand that the number of hands involved, and the thought of dressing an avatar, and actually going shopping and trying things on via an avatar before you get something made for you is quite interesting, because that might lead us to some kind of sustainability with respect to material in terms of consuming less. So I often read about sustainable materials in fashion, knowing about cotton being, you know, cotton and wool being a plant and an animal product, natural fibers, and the move towards natural fibers away from synthetic fibers. So what are your views on sustainable materials, and whether this, you know, will have a material effect on the footprint of the fashion industry? And yeah, I mean, whoever wants to go first, I'm happy.
Well, I think, Tony, we can see that there are some responsible organisations out there, some responsible brands who are really doing some interesting stuff, some really cutting edge stuff, and we can see that they are making progress in terms of reducing their carbon footprint, their water footprint, reducing their reliance on some of the chemicals that are commonly used. So we can see also new technologies coming through in terms of how we can process textiles to reduce some of those environmental impacts. A lot of work's been done around modern slavery in terms of supporting workers, particularly with the pandemic and the impact that that's had. And we can also see some really interesting collaborations going on in terms of brands and retailers working with organizations like Oxfam, for example, in terms of taking waste back, and also working with cutting edge innovation, looking at how we can recycle textiles. So I think what we can see there is some really good examples of best practice. The big question is actually, is it enough? And is it happening fast enough? And is it happening across the board? And to the answer to that last question first, it is not happening across the board. There are too many brands, too many organizations who are not taking accountability for the impacts that they have. So we've got some really good opportunities to make a big step in the right direction. But fundamentally, what we've got to get back to, and this is sort of the elephant in the room, is what we saw with the SCAP program, so the Sustainable Clothing Action Plan program, is all of the benefits that we got in terms of saving water and carbon. And the measurement for that was, how much water and carbon can you save per ton of garments produced? That was almost completely wiped out because we were selling even more tons of clothing in the UK. So, so the big elephant in the room is this consumption challenge. But again, the challenge there is really what we want to be able to do is we need to be able to deliver fashion that fulfills the consumer's needs, but doing it in a way that's using less materials, less resource, but also making sure that we're supporting workers within the supply chain, that we don't end up in a situation which we've seen already in the pandemic. Actually, I read something very recently that there have been thousands and thousands of people who have been made redundant, who don't have an income, because we had to turn off orders for fashion as a result of COVID. And if we're not careful, and if we follow some people's advice of it's slow fashion only, we're going to create a huge issue in terms of poverty in the developing world.
Sandy, you've worked a lot in sustainable materials. So do you think the route for sustainability in the fashion industry is through materials, through research and innovation, through working practices?
I think it's all the above. And the thing is, the problem is it's complex, it's interrelated, and there's no one answer that have to work. We have to move forward on all of these areas, so it's not just a question of I'm sustainable because I'm using organic cotton, not if all of the other issues, around social justice issues are not being looked at. But I think, the circular economy is put as a sort of the answer. It's part of the answer, because at the moment less than 1% of all textiles and clothing is actually recycled into textiles and clothing, and still, legislation is hopefully coming that will change this, but it's still too much going to incineration and landfill. But also, we're making textiles out of waste products like plastic bottles, which are from another sector, which is okay, but we're not actually recovering and retaining the benefits of the textiles that have already been produced, which could be they're not even being downcycled, they're just being lost. So I think none of this is any good unless we're reducing consumption a lot, as we keep saying. But also, I think there's a lot of R&D in terms of new alternative materials, which I think can help. Mushroom leather, various products that looks as though it's going really quite well as a sort of substitute, a vegetable substitute. The idea of chemical recycling is a lot of research and development going on, and these things take a long time to come through. Obviously, I'm sure you and Mark know more about all of this than I do, but we've got enough polyester already existing that's in the ground and wasted that could have been remade into new materials. So I think we've got a lot of structural systems to put in place in terms of sorting, collecting, and managing waste in order that it can be recycled. And there's a lot of initiatives in terms of biomaterials and waste, orange fibre. There's been all of that is actually going on, and I think will make a contribution. But I think we need everything to work in a much more coordinated way. We need all of the solutions.
A decade ago, we had a conversation about, Sandy and I had a conversation about how we might design materials that could be disassembled to get the pieces back in order to do to start that circularity going a bit better. And it's interesting when I watch what happens in my house, because for those who are here today who are Grantham students, I have a couple of daughters who are about your age, and they either they wear things that are either what they call retro, that I call secondhand, or they wear things from ASOS or Pretty Little Thing or Monkey, or those fast brands, and they seem to they have one wardrobe that has kind of both ends of the spectrum in retro that they really value, even to the extent of pulling 20-year-old t-shirts out of my drawer, and then the high volume, high throughput things. And I've been watching.
It's interesting, isn't it, Tony? Sorry, I did totally jump in there, but it's interesting, isn't it, when we start thinking about individual consumers, and it's always interesting talking to academics about their children, because their children always seem to be the same. But I think there's there's a lot of focus on what brands and retailers are doing. There's a lot of focus on what industry is doing, but I think actually we also need to carefully but very clearly identify what consumers are doing as well in terms of their behaviour. And it's interesting, the Ellen MacArthur statement about only 1% of material gets recycled. If you go and talk to a recycling company that deals with clothing, they are potentially recycling and reusing at least 70% of the stuff that comes into their organisation. Now, the reason that we don't get more stuff going to the recyclers is because consumers are not behaving in a responsible way. So let's say everyone carried on buying all the stuff that they did currently. If actually the only thing they ever did was to actually dispose of their garments in a responsible way, we could be in a situation where instead of it being 1%, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation claim, we could be approaching something like 70%. Now, there will be a big challenge, obviously, because we will end up with a mass of garments floating around if we stay in the same consumption levels. But I raise that point just because I think it's important that we do recognise that consumers play an important role in this, in terms of how we can deal with some of these big challenges.
So Marcus Rashford, who's kind of the modern saint, right? He's the face of Levi's Buy Better, Wear Longer campaign, which has been quite interesting to watch. And I guess one question is, okay, if we do consume less by buying better and wear longer, how do we make sure that value is captured not by the company headquarters in the West that hardly pays any tax and delivered to the people who are growing the cotton, manufacturing the jeans, right? Is there something the industry can go, to help maintain livelihoods in the areas where clothes are produced, whilst also delivering this change in modality in consumption?
Well, we obviously got to talk about transparency, and
I was just going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Trying to understand, how we can use transparency in a positive way to try and drive that sort of change. But again, I would strongly argue that there are responsible brands and retailers who are operating in supply chains where there's a lot of work being done to ensure that happens. The real big challenge is things like the UK legislation for modern slavery. The current legislation is not fit for purpose. And that current legislation would actually, if it was fit for purpose, would actually fight the corner of the workers in the supply chain. Because what that legislation is saying is if you're engaging in aspects of modern slavery, and poor pay or bonded labour or forced labour is part of that, if that legislation was fit for purpose, we would see more brands being prosecuted, not for what's going on in a factory in Leicester, but for what's going on in a factory in Bangladesh or in a factory in China. So I think there's a massive piece of work that needs to be done around that transparency of how we can actually bring that sort of ethical component to the fore.
I mean, there are organisations. I mean, that I was going to also bring up transparency, which is, I think, more and more, and consumers are gradually wanting to ask more and find out more, and that needs to be encouraged, so that you know, nothing should be available that includes modern slavery. But it's also about stopping things like the ridiculous rampant consumerism of something like Black Friday. And there are some brands and companies that are refusing outright to reduce things and have markdowns because it devalues the product. And something like and some of them have made stances on the Black Friday that they just will not take part in it, and encourage people to repair instead, or certainly donate instead, or just really think about is that needed. So I think there's lots of things in terms of legislation and so on that need to be done, but I think because the producing countries have begun, some obviously rely a huge amount on the fashion industry, and it's a bigger earner for these businesses. It's so important that those conditions are decent, and so that we can still reduce. They can still have a livelihood by being paid better for producing less, and we can have to pay a little bit more for what is made without slavery conditions. So it can be a virtuous circle.
So I think the G7 are meeting at the moment. It's pretty clear from looking at the pictures that fashion's not high on their agenda. But the role of government in terms of financial instruments, nudges, policy change. How businesses are regulated with respect to their tax structures. Do you think they have a role to play in ensuring that fashion has a lower a lower resource impact, while at the same time driving an equitable distribution of its wealth creation?
Absolutely. I mean, Mark will obviously, and we were part of contributing to the Environmental Audit Committee's report that came out in 2019 originally, before the pandemic, that was called Fixing Fashion, and it gave lots of recommendations. Also, the UN Charter for Climate Change has talked about targets to meet, for achieving Sustainable Development Goals. There's all of that is vital that's taken into account. So I think the policy work, tax incentives, so that there are plenty of people. It's not at all a level playing field, because we've got people doing very great things, often bigger companies and very small companies, but they're competing on the same terms and with the same sort of tax regime as people who aren't doing good work and on meeting any sustainability targets. So there can be a lot done in terms of incentivizing the people doing better things and penalising those who are not. So I think that, you know, we've just produced a policy note, and the Fixing Fashion inquiry was reopened at the end of last year, and so it's hopefully is on the agenda still. And I know.
Yeah, I feel quite frustrated and not enthused by governments, particularly at the moment, and not just around fashion, but I'll stick with fashion. I won't get too political with this. But there's very few people I've met within the policy-making circles, within politicians, who have any real understanding of what the fashion industry is, what the fashion industry does, and the complexity of the industry. And by the way, we should just point out here at this stage that I've talked to lots of people who work in food. I've talked to lots of people that work in heavy industry. I've spoken to a number of people who are involved in manufacturing of engines for aircraft. And when we talk about supply chains, it becomes really quite obvious that textiles and fashion has some of the most complex and difficult supply chains to navigate and to manage. And I think politicians, you know, and policymakers don't really grasp that. So that's a failure, I guess, in terms of, you know, as an individual involved in teaching this as an academic. That's a failure on my part that we don't get that message across. So I think, you know, that there's a really big challenge there in terms of people understanding the industry. And I've just noticed one of the questions in the chat about hemp as an alternative to cotton. And absolutely, and you know, hemp is a good fibre when it's manufactured in the way that it is, or grown in the way it is. And politicians have talked about, you know, using hemp. But what politicians don't understand is that the global production of hemp is about 30,000 tonnes a year.
Yeah.
Cotton consumption, as it stands at the moment, is 26 million tonnes. So even if we wanted to convert, and we're able to convert, you know, cotton to hemp, there's just not enough of it around. And you know, the production levels as it stands at the moment, it just wouldn't touch the sides. So it's understanding the complexities of where we are and how we can transition from where we are to this sort of more sustainable future. And that's why, you know, I'd say I get frustrated about government intervention, because I'll give you another example of where government intervention within textiles is flawed. The United States subsidizes cotton production in the United States, and as a result of that subsidy, it deflates the value of cotton globally, which means for farmers in places like East and West Africa and for India and for Pakistan, the price that they get in the market is deflated because the United States is supporting their own farmers. So there's some really difficult geopolitical issues that you know, affects the industry indirectly and directly.
One of the great things about running these discussion meetings online is that I can see the questions that are coming up and actually do a bit of research straight away on my own. Okay, so Sarah Greenwood asks, is the 100-day dress challenge a gimmick? So I didn't know what the 100-day dress challenge was, so I looked it up just now, and basically it's to wear a woolen dress for 100 days, to recognise 100 consecutive days, in recognition of the fact that actually lots of the environmental impacts of clothing are in its washing. And it's the washing that produces microplastics that people are worried about. It's the washing that well, not so much now when people wash at lower temperatures. There's a big energy input. There's all the surfactants going into the water system. So is the 100-day dress challenge a gimmick, or should we actually be hanging clothes up to air off?
We should.
Well, the answer to that is absolutely yes, and particularly if you're going to use wool, it's a really interesting fibre because of the complex structure of wool fibres. It absorbs odour, and actually doesn't smell the next day if you air it. So that's brilliant. However, and this is the interesting thing about these types of challenges. A wool dress will not last anywhere as long as a polyester dress.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the real challenge here. So again, I've seen some of the questions asking about durability. I've got a base layer garment that I bought when I was a student, which is a very long time ago.
Smelly Hansen.
Yeah, exactly. You know exactly where I'm going with this, Tony. That garment is still perfectly functional 30 years later. Now, I actually prefer wearing a wool base layer because it's more comfortable, it's more breathable, and it doesn't smell. But I go through those because I do a lot of cycling. I go through those. I'll go through a wool base layer at least one a year. So we've got this real interesting challenge now of, and this is why we in terms of the research that we do at Leeds, we're taking a systemic view of understanding sustainability. It is not just as simple as saying this material has a lower impact than this material. What we have to build into the discussion is, what is the product, what's its function, and over its life cycle, what is a better product? And I would argue in some cases, and in fact, this is not my argument, the science tells us in some cases, a polyester garment is significantly more sustainable than a cotton garment. Now, that is based on, and going back to that question, Tony, about the 100-day dress, that is based on some assumptions about how consumers behave. And yes, the 100-day dress challenge could be really interesting. It will remain a gimmick if the person who does that then just reverts back to their normal behavior afterwards. That is a gimmick. Now, if we can find a way of encouraging and helping people to keep that type of approach, we're moving away from the normal cultural aspects of fashion to something that is becoming a little bit more sustainable.
So just for those who weren't in on and Sandy, I'm coming to you. I know you have a lot. I know you work a lot in this area. But a Smelly Hansen, the brand name is actually Helly Hansen, and they're known as Smelly Hansens in the kind of outdoor world because they absolutely stink within seconds of you putting them on, because they're made from polypropylene, and that's a fantastic place for the microbes that consume the sebum that you produce, and in doing so produce thiols. So there you go. Just thought I'd drop that in. Sandy, you were eager to talk about airing, not
just say,
washing.
yeah, absolutely. I think just clothing practices are something that have been sort of undervalued. I think when there are lots of things you can do. I've had PhD students also looking at this different types of scenarios for what we do. You've got something that's been freshly washed and you put it back and it's in the wardrobe or in the drawer and you get it out. You've got something you've worn once but you could wear again. So where do you put that? You put it over the back of a chair maybe. But I mean, we could be looking much more at sort of encouraging, obviously less washing, lower temperatures. That's that message, the lower temperature message has got through. But we could be doing a lot more things. That we can be displaying our clothes in many different ways. We can have this sort of transition. People already have a sort of they have, as you said, good clothes, working clothes, gardening clothes, that sort of thing. I think if we can and also there's such a move now to look after clothes. I think that's one thing that has really changed in recent times. The rise of the sort of repair movements and DIY, whether it's visible mending, which is like celebrating the mending that you're doing, so it's not trying to hide and pretend it hasn't worn out. I mean, I wear things out. The elbows go. I hold up the fabric and it's absolutely so. But things can take a lot of wear and tear more so. I've also had a PhD student who's looked at consumers' perceptions of fast fashion. I mean, I haven't got a huge amount of experience in consumer behaviour, but just seeing that they make those judgments when they're buying things, they they're using their sort of tacit knowledge to think, well, it's got that on it, that'll probably go. Oh, but maybe I'll wear it for. It's like, should we label things with the number of wears that they might last for? Do we want to make things that last for a short time deliberately and last for a long time deliberately? I think there's a lot of scenarios, and about sort of wearing the same thing. I mean, I've published some papers in the journal about this sort of thing, where people have tried experiments with looking at just wearing either the same piece or one type of piece for a long period of time. It's a very different mindset, but I think one that's really worth is the experience of it. I think helps people appreciate what we're really doing with our clothes, and I think we just have to have that much closer relationship with the physicality of the clothes, as well as and the fact that we're imbuing ourselves within those clothes.
I think so.
I think one of the things, sorry, Tony, one of the interesting things about consumers, and again, just looking at some of the questions that are coming up, is washing clothes gets clothes clean, but it actually makes a significant reduction to their life cycle, their lifetime. Washing your clothes is almost the worst thing you can do to them in terms of their long-term durability, and that's one of the things that we found in terms of the project we did looking at garment durability. One of the key tests that we did was washing garments, repeat washing, to see how long they stood up, and very, very quickly. And in particular, I mean, there's a lot of talk about fast fashion, but some of the products that we tested that came from the luxury end of the market were, in fact, the one product in particular was so bad, we tested it twice because we couldn't believe how bad it was in terms of its wash durability. So that washing thing is almost a win-win. You don't wash your garments as much, and therefore it will last longer. You'll save water, you'll save energy, you're not releasing microfibers, etc. But again, culturally, it's become so easy to wash garments. My grandmother would spend at least 2 days a week doing the family washing because it took 2 days a week to do it. Now, stick it in a washing machine, takes 30 minutes to refresh, stick it on the line or tumble dry it, and it's so easy. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of convenience is now changing the way, or has changed our view of fashion. It's so convenient to get fashion and to use it.
So we've ticked off an awful lot of questions. I think Wendy, we've ticked off your wearer intervention question, adapting and modifying your own clothes. Sarah Greenwood's 100-day challenge has provoked quite a bit of discussion. We've dealt with hemp. Rebecca Collins talked about durability, and actually I'd like both of you to think about what durability means in terms of her questions, the pilling and the fading. One of the great devices we have in our house, which was a complete revelation to me, is we have a jumper shaver. So you can shave the pilling off of a jumper.
You can, I've done it.
So how does that aesthetic dimension come into the definition of durability? Sandy, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some things that age gracefully. People use, old leather, obviously denim being one of the key ones, and leather being another one, that they become more attached to them the more personalized the aging and the sort of damage is. And I think that's a very sort of emotional involvement. I think the pilling is something that people really don't want. And I think in the research I've been involved in, that that would be seen as something that was very negative and would immediately, it might get in some cases just thrown away. But I think that the notion of caring for your clothes is something that has disappeared. I think it was something that certainly my mother's generation and would have just done for granted because they had to make things last as long as possible. Yeah. So I think that I think that that appreciation. There are things that can be done. I mean, there's. What we don't want is too many. If we want to be able to recycle fibres, we don't want too many anti-pilling finishes on the clothing either. So in one's a trade-off to the other. If you might get pilling where you don't. So a good shaver would be would really help, and people see it as just normal maintenance. And I think it's maintenance that I think disappeared very, very largely.
Yeah, Mark, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk about durability, because we tend to just say, okay, we define durability for fashion as being X or Y. The fashion industry is built on this idea of segmentation, that we have different segments of the market with different fashion needs. And I think if we take that view, durability can mean lots of different things. So, for example, with denim, Sandy hinted at this. Denim actually looks and feels better as it sort of erodes, as it gets worn and washed down. So we end up with a garment that actually we have a much closer emotional connection with it as it actually gets worse in many ways as a result of washing and wearing. And then the converse to that would be, a very formal, let's say black dress that you're going to be wearing to a party. If that fades, if that pills, if that shrinks, or that is counter. So durability is measured in lots of different ways. In terms of what I would call this sort of technical durability, what does it look and feel like? The emotional durability, though, I think is actually becoming much more important. That emotional connection, which is associated with the aesthetic of the garment, but actually is associated with the experiences that we have when we're wearing the garment. And if you think about those garments that you're really attached to, and think about why you're attached to them. I had a PhD student who did a lot of research looking at this, and it was really interesting how that emotional connection with garments can swing both ways. One of the participants, and obviously I shan't name names here, but she had just recently got divorced and decided, in spite of the fact that she was considered to be really quite eco-friendly, she decided that every single garment that reminded her of her ex-partner, she was going to dispose of. She didn't want that emotional connection. So that, and of course we see it going the other way as well. I mean, I'm sure many people maybe have had a family member who has maybe passed away, and you've taken one of their garments as a point of remembrance. So that emotional connection, that emotional durability is something that is really difficult to predict, really difficult to manage in this mass production cycle that we have that is currently fashion. But if we can find a way of tapping into that, that's also really interesting opportunity to try and turn down that consumption model that we're so dependent on at the moment.
So it's 1842 with a few minutes left, and I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and the connection that Sandy, for me, that it's like this is like a conversation we've been having a long time. The connection between the rational and the resource and the emotions,
Yes.
because if there's anything, because we are so intimately involved with our clothes, it has a lot to teach us about sustainability in a broader context. So I think I'm hoping that we've dealt with nearly all the questions in the chat. The first one that came up was about the inverse relationship between cost and durability, and we've been back to that a few times. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Sandy and Mark for being so engaging. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you very much, and well done to the organisers as well, who I think are going to come along and say something now.
Thank you.
Or maybe they're not. I'm just reading. I'm just doing your script. James, Matthew.
Sorry, I'll jump in. So yeah, I just want to take a second to thank everybody that's been involved with the event. Sandy and Mark as well for coming in as speakers, and Tony for agreeing to host the event. Speaking on behalf of hopefully everyone in the chat, I really enjoyed the session, and I look forward to at some point potentially working with you again in the future.
Yeah, great.
So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great to see both of you again, Tony and Mark. Been quite a long time.
Get together. Especially as Mark and his wardrobe seem to have an awful lot in common. Well, the smelly Hudsons. Yeah. Cool. Right.
Hopefully, at some point we can have a face-to-face meeting, which would be great,
Yes.
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot,
Yeah.
James.
Yeah.
James.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
James, Matthew, and Chinchin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Have a good evening.
Yeah. Great. All right. Bye now. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. I'm going to go taking my wife out for dinner.